A millionaire returns to sell his dead wife's abandoned home. But when he knocks on the door, she answers it, holding their son. Hello, friends. Welcome to our story. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a like on this video. It truly helps us more than you know. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Nigeria? Canada? The UK? The United States? We read every single comment, and we love hearing from you. Now, let's get into the story. The black sedan moved slowly, its polished tires crunching softly over red dirt road as the Kenyan countryside stretched endlessly on both sides. Rolling green hills, open sky, the kind of silence that feels heavy. In the back seat, Adrian Vale sat very still. He was 38 years old. His royal blue suit was perfectly tailored, not a single crease out of place. His shoes, hand-stitched Italian leather, caught the afternoon light through the window. His briefcase rested beside him, packed tight with property documents, legal forms, and a deed that had been sitting in the file for 5 long years. From the outside, Adrian Vale looked like a man who had conquered the world. And in many ways, he had. He ran a global real estate development firm with offices in London, Dubai, and Nairobi. He flew private. He shook hands with ministers and billionaires. He had built himself from nothing into something most men only dreamed about. But if you look closely, really closely, at his face, you would see it. Something behind the eyes. Something tight and locked away, like a room no one was allowed to enter. Sir, we're about 5 minutes out, said his driver, keeping his voice low and respectful. Adrian gave a small nod. He didn't speak. He was going to see the house. Their house. The small wooden home at the edge of a quiet rural village where he and Lila had started everything together. Before the contracts, before the boardrooms, before the private jet and the penthouse and the life that swallowed him whole. He was going to sell it. A property developer had made a generous offer. Tear it down, build something new, move on. Smart business. Clean business. That's what he told himself. He stared out the window as the smooth tarmac gave way to a narrow dirt road, and the manicured greenery of the city's edge dissolved into something rawer, wilder. A cluster of children chased a dog near a wooden fence. A woman balanced a water container on her head with effortless grace. Goats wandered freely across the path. Adrian's jaw tightened. 5 years. 5 years since he had last breathed this air. He closed his eyes for just a moment, and the memory hit him like a wave crashing against stone. It was 2:17 in the morning. He remembered the exact time because he had just looked at his phone when it rang. The number was from the local police station. He almost didn't answer. Mr. Vale. The officer's voice had been careful, the way voices get when they are carrying something too heavy to say directly. There has been an accident on the Kisumu Road. A vehicle fire. Your wife, Lila Vale. She was identified from personal effects of the scene. I'm so sorry, sir. She didn't survive. He had stood in his hotel room in Nairobi for what felt like hours. Phone pressed to his ear long after the call ended, just standing there in the dark. The funeral had been closed casket. The fire had been too severe, they told him. He had buried her anyway. He had buried a box. He had buried the softest part of himself right along with it. And he had not looked back. Until now. The car rolled to a stop. Adrian stepped out slowly, his polished shoes pressing into the red African earth. He straightened his jacket out of habit and stood there, looking at what remained of the house. It was worse than he expected. The wooden planks had darkened and warped with age. The thatched roof sagged heavily on one side. The door stood slightly crooked in its frame, like it had given up trying to close properly. Weeds had pushed up along the base of the walls. This was where they had been young together, where they had argued over small things and laughed over nothing, where he had held her face in his hands and promised her the world. He exhaled slowly. He reached into his briefcase to retrieve the property documents, and that's when he stopped. There were footprints in the yard. Fresh ones. Small, barefooted prints pressed into the earth beside the door. He looked up. A thin ribbon of smoke was curling up from behind the house, gray and quiet, rising steadily into the afternoon sky. Someone was here. Adrian's heartbeat shifted. He told himself it was probably squatters. Probably nothing. He was a businessman, not a man who believed in ghosts. He walked to the door. He knocked 3 times. And then the door opened. If you want to find out what Adrian saw when that door opened, subscribe right now and turn on your notifications. We post new episodes every week. Like this video to help more people find this story. And drop a comment below. Do you think Lila is really alive? Tell us what you think. The wood groaned. Not loudly, just a soft, tired sound. The sound of something old and worn being asked to move after a long rest. The latch clicked from the inside, a small mechanical sound that somehow cut through the open countryside like a knife through silence. Adrian didn't move. His hand was still raised from knocking, suspended in the air as the door began to swing inward. Slowly, reluctantly, as though whatever was on the other side was just as uncertain about this moment as he was. The afternoon light shifted, and then he saw her. She stood in the doorway wearing a faded red dress. The fabric, washed so many times the pattern had softened into something barely visible. Her feet were bare against the wooden floor, toes pressing into the dark grain of the old boards. She was thinner than he remembered, her collarbone more prominent, her frame carrying a quietness that hadn't been there before. Her hair was pulled back simply. No jewelry, no makeup, and her eyes, those eyes that had once lit up entire rooms, were cautious now, guarded, almost frightened, the way an animal looks when it hears a sound it cannot immediately identify as safe or dangerous. Adrian's breath left his body. His mind began running immediately, desperately, through every rational explanation it could locate. A relative, a cousin he'd forgotten, someone who resembled her. Grief playing one final cruel trick on a man who had spent 5 years trying to move past it. But then her head tilted slightly, just slightly, and the light caught the left side of her face. The scar, just above her eyebrow. Small, curved, faint. The mark she'd carried since childhood from falling off a bicycle on a stone road outside her mother's house. He had kissed that scar 1,000 times. He had traced it with his thumb in the dark when she was sleeping. He knew it the way you know a constellation you've spent years staring at. No cousin carried that scar. No stranger. No grief-born illusion. His briefcase dropped an inch in his grip before his hand tightened again reflexively. The only part of him still functioning on instinct rather than shock. She was real. She was standing in front of him. She was breathing. He could see the slight rise and fall of her chest. He could see her pulse moving at her throat. He could see her fingers gripping the edge of the door, knuckles pale against the dark wood, holding it half open the way you hold a door when you haven't yet decided whether to welcome someone in or slam it shut. 5 years. 5 years of a closed coffin and a folded program and a grave marker in grief that had hollowed him out and filled him back up with ambition just so he could keep functioning like a human being. 5 years of learning not to reach across the bed in his sleep. 5 years of deleting her contact from his phone 3 times because he kept restoring it. And she was standing in a doorway in a faded red dress like none of it had happened. A small movement broke his paralysis. From behind her, half concealed by the fold of her dress, a boy appeared. For years old, perhaps. Small, barefoot like his mother, wearing a yellow shirt that was slightly too big for his narrow shoulders. The child moved cautiously, gripping the fabric of Lila's dress in one tight fist, pressing himself against her side the way children do when they sense that something in the adult world has suddenly shifted and they are not sure which way to lean. The boy stared at Adrian, and Adrian stared back. The world went very quiet, because those eyes, wide, still, deeply observant, were not Lila's eyes. Lila's eyes were warm brown, almost amber in sunlight. These eyes were darker, more direct, set at an angle that Adrian had seen before only once in his life, in every mirror he had ever looked into. His own eyes, looking back at him from the face of a child who should not exist. A son he had never been told about. A son who had grown 4 years in a house Adrian had been told was empty, in a life Adrian had been told was over. Behind a door that stood 30 meters from a grave marker bearing the name of the woman now standing in front of him, alive and trembling and refusing to fully meet his gaze. The silence between them stretched and stretched, 5 years compressed into 10 unbearable seconds of nothing but wind and bird song and the distant sound of the boys' quiet breathing. Adrian opened his mouth. The word came out barely above a sound. Rough, broken, like something that had been stored too long in the dark and had almost forgotten its own shape. Lila. She closed her eyes when she heard it, just for a moment, as if the sound of her own name in his voice was something she had been bracing herself against for a very long time. When she opened them again, she looked directly at him, and in that look was something complicated and deep and full of the pain he didn't yet have the map to navigate. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, the way you speak when you are delivering something terrible and you have rehearsed it many times. You weren't supposed to come back. Friends, drop everything you're doing and subscribe right now, because this story is only getting started and you do not want to miss what comes next. Why is Lila alive? Who is that little boy? And what does she mean? He wasn't supposed to come back. Like this video, so more people find this story and tell us in the comments. Do you think Lila chose to disappear? Or was she forced to? We read every single comment. Nobody moved for a long moment. The wind pushed softly against the back of Adrian's jacket. A bird called somewhere in the distance across the open countryside. The small boy pressed closer against Lila's dress, watching Adrian with those dark, careful eyes that saw too much for someone so young. Then Lila stepped back from the doorway. It wasn't an invitation exactly. It was something smaller than that. A concession. An acknowledgement that this moment had arrived and there was no longer any door, wooden or otherwise, that could stop it. Adrian stepped inside. The interior was dim after the brightness outside, and it took his eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, he stood very still and looked at what surrounded him. The floor was swept clean, the bare wood smooth from years of use. A clay water jug sat in the corner near a small basin, its surface dark and cool to the touch. A folded stack of laundry, small clothes, a woman's blouse, a pair of tiny shorts, rested neatly on the edge of a wooden chair. The furniture was sparse and simple. A low table, 2 mismatched stools, a narrow cot along the far wall covered with a faded blanket folded with deliberate care. There were no luxuries here. No soft lighting, no imported furniture, no thread count worth mentioning. This was not comfort. This was survival. Patient, quiet, daily survival. The kind that doesn't announce itself or ask for recognition. Just continues. On the floor near the table, half tucked against the leg of a stool, sat a toy car. Small, hand-carved, the edges sanded smooth. Someone had painted it badly, blue on one side, slightly green on the other, where the paint had run out or changed. It was clearly made by hand. It was clearly loved. The wheels were worn down on one side from being pushed along the same path many times. Adrian looked at it for a long moment. He had grown up without toys like this. He had grown up without much of anything. And somewhere along the way, he had told himself that when he had children, they would have everything. Every comfort he never had. Every door opened before they even knew to knock. He had imagined that life so clearly. A nursery with good light. Books stacked on low shelves. A child who would grow up knowing exactly who they were and exactly who stood behind them. He had never imagined this room. He had never imagined this child. The boy had moved away from Lila now, just slightly. Cautious curiosity had overtaken caution itself, the way it always does with children who are fundamentally unafraid of the world, even when they've been taught to be careful in it. He stood a few feet from Adrian, barefoot on the swept floor, his small chin tilted upward so he could get a proper look at this tall stranger in the blue suit who had appeared at the door his mother never opened to strangers. Adrian looked down at him, and he felt something shift in his chest with a force that had nothing to do with business or strategy or the careful emotional architecture he had spent 5 years constructing around himself. Because the jawline was his. He could see it clearly now in the way the boy's face sat on his neck, the slight squareness of it even in childhood softness. And the way he tilted his head right side down as if balancing a thought. Adrian did that. He had always done that. His mother used to tease him about it when he was small. This child was made of him. What is his name? Adrian asked. His voice came out steadier than he expected. A professional habit. Keep the voice level. Give nothing away until you understand the room. Lila had been standing near the wall, arms crossed over herself, watching them both with an expression that Adrian could not yet fully read. Something between relief and grief, and something he had no word for. "Micah," she said quietly. "Micah." Adrian turned the name over in his mind. He looked at the boy. Micah looked back at him with those dark eyes that gave nothing away and took everything in. Adrian's mind had already been doing the calculation, the way a mind trained in numbers and timelines does automatically, without permission. It had started the moment he first saw the child's face in the doorway. Micah was 4, perhaps 4.5, which meant he had been conceived. His mind moved carefully through the arithmetic before the accident, before the late-night phone call, before the closed coffin and the folded funeral program and the grave on the hill with Lila's name carved into stone. Lila had been pregnant when she disappeared. She had been carrying his son, and she had said nothing. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls closer. Adrian was aware of his own breathing in a way he hadn't been in years. Micah took one step forward, then another. He stopped directly in front of Adrian and looked up at him with a pure, uncomplicated directness that only very young children and very old people possess. People who have not yet learned, or have long since stopped, performing for the world. He studied Adrian's face carefully, methodically, the way Adrian himself studied a contract before signing. Then the boy asked his question. Soft, simple, the most devastating 4 words Adrian Vale had ever heard in 38 years of living. And he had heard some terrible things. "Are you my father?" The boardroom had never broken him. Not the failed deals, not the hostile takeovers, not the years of sleeping in his car before the first company took off. Not even a phone call from the police at 2:17 in the morning. But a 4-year-old boy standing barefoot on a swept wooden floor, asking a question he already seemed to know the answer to, that broke something open in Adrian Vale that he was not sure he had the tools to repair. He could not speak. He understood, in this moment, with a completeness that bypassed logic entirely, what he had actually lost 5 years ago. Not just a wife, not just a relationship, a partnership, a love story. He had lost the first word Micah ever spoke, the first step he ever took, the first time he laughed, really laughed, with his whole body the way small children do. The first fever, the first nightmare, the first morning. 5 years. 5 years of his son's life, lived in this quiet room with a carved toy car and a clay water jug, and he hadn't known. He hadn't known. Friends, if that question from little Micah hit you as hard as it hit us, like this video right now, because this story deserves to be seen. Subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on your notifications so you don't miss Chapter 4, because next week, Adrian finally demands answers. And what Lila tells him will change everything you think you know about this story. Drop a comment below. Are you on Lila's side, or do you think she had no right to keep Micah hidden? We want to hear from you. Lila didn't sit down when she began talking. She stood near the window, her back half turned, looking out at the stretch of open countryside beyond the warped glass. Her arms were crossed over her chest, not defensively, Adrian thought, but the way a person holds themselves when they are carrying something very heavy and have been carrying alone for so long that the posture has become part of their body. Micah had been settled onto the narrow cot with his carved toy car. He pushed it back and forth along the blanket quietly, occasionally glancing up at the 2 adults with those watchful eyes, sensing the weight in the room without yet having the language to name it. Adrian sat on one of the wooden stools. He had set his briefcase on the floor beside him. The property documents inside suddenly seemed like objects from another life. Paperwork belonging to a man who had walked up a dirt road 20 minutes ago, thinking this would take an hour, and then he would be gone. He waited. He had learned, over years of difficult negotiations, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a room is simply go still and let the other person find their way to the truth at their own pace. But nothing in 20 years of business had prepared him for this particular truth. Lila drew a long breath, and then she began. It wasn't an accident, she said. Her voice was quiet and flat, the way voices get when they have rehearsed something in their own mind so many times that the emotion has been worn smooth. None of it was. Adrian said nothing. He waited. She turned slightly from the window, not fully toward him, somewhere in between. That night, I was on the Kisumu Road. I was coming back from my sister's. I hadn't told you yet. She paused. I had found out 3 days before. I was waiting for the right moment. I wanted to tell you in person, somewhere quiet. I had a plan. A ghost of something crossed her face, the memory of a happiness that had been cut down before it could flower. I was going to tell you that weekend. Adrian felt the information land in his chest and stay there. She had been pregnant. She had known. She had been planning a moment to share it with him, something small and private and theirs. And then the road had taken everything. Except it wasn't the road. There were 2 vehicles, Lila continued. I noticed them behind me, maybe 3 kilometers before the curve. They stayed too close. I thought at first it was just bad drivers. Then they moved up on both sides. Her jaw tightened. I didn't have time to do anything. They pushed me off the road. The car had gone down an embankment. She remembered the rolling, the noise, glass somewhere, and then stillness and the smell of petrol. She had been conscious. Barely. Hands had reached in through the broken window. Not to help her, or not only to help her, to move her. Quickly, efficiently, without speaking. She had been pulled from the wreck and carried through darkness to a vehicle she never saw clearly. By the time she registered what was happening around her, the car behind them was already burning. She woke up in a warehouse. Concrete floor. High windows too dirty to see through. A single fluorescent light overhead that buzzed and flickered. 2 men in the room, neither of whom gave names or showed faces clearly. They were not nervous. That was the thing that frightened her most. They had the calm of people who had done this kind of thing before and expected it to work out exactly as planned. They told her to listen carefully. They told her that Adrian Vale had made enemies. Powerful ones. People who had been watching him build his empire and had decided that the simplest way to dismantle a man's ambition was not to attack the man. It was to threaten everything he loved. They had been watching. They knew about her. They had decided she was the point of entry. The ultimatum was straightforward. Disappear. Completely. No contact, no word, no trace. Become someone who no longer existed. If she did this, Adrian would be left alone. His business, his safety, his life. If she refused, or if she ever surfaced, they would destroy him. Financially first, then personally, then, if necessary, permanently. She was pregnant. She was alone in a concrete room. She had no phone, no way to reach anyone, no way to verify whether the threat was real or a bluff. She believed it was real. They had falsified the dental records. She learned this later, piecing it together. Someone inside the system had been paid. The burn vehicle had been planted with her belongings, her bag, her identification, specific items that would confirm identity without question. Authorities had been quietly steered toward the conclusion that required the least investigation. And Adrian, devastated and alone, had never looked for another explanation. Why would he? The evidence was complete. The conclusion was delivered to him sealed and official and absolute. Grief, she said softly, is the most effective blindfold ever invented. She had been relocated 3 days later. A remote rural area, hours from the city. A house arranged for her, this house. Occasionally a vehicle would pass slowly on the road outside, or a stranger would appear at the market in the village, watching without watching. Supervision that was never acknowledged, but always present. And then gradually it stopped. The vehicles no longer slowed. The strangers no longer appeared. Months passed, then a year, then 2. Whatever interests had orchestrated her disappearance had either moved on, achieved what they wanted, or decided the arrangement was stable enough to leave unmonitored. But the fear did not leave with them, because by then, Micah had been born. By then she had something far more precious to protect than her own freedom. And the calculation had shifted in a way she had never anticipated, because now disappearing wasn't just about keeping Adrian safe. It was about keeping their son invisible to whoever had wanted her gone. If I had come back, she said, finally turning fully toward him, her eyes steady and direct and full of 5 years of decisions she had made every single morning. And they were still watching. They wouldn't just use me against you. She looked briefly toward the cot, where Micah pushed his small car along the blanket. They would have used him. The room was completely silent. Adrian had not moved from the stool. He was looking at her with an expression she could not fully read, and she had once known his face better than her own. He looked down at his hands, then back up at her, and she saw it. The moment a man who has built his entire identity around control and forward motion comes face to face with 5 years of a story he was never given the chance to be part of. He didn't speak yet, but his hands, she noticed, were shaking. Friends, Lila didn't disappear because she wanted to. She disappeared to save the man she loved. But now that Adrian knows the truth, who is really behind this? And what is he going to do next? Subscribe right now so you don't miss Chapter 5, because the investigation is about to begin and the answers are going to shock you. Like this video if this story is pulling you in, and drop a comment below. Do you think the people who threaten Lila are still watching? Tell us what you think. The briefcase hit the floor, not thrown. Adrian Vale was not a man who threw things. It simply left his hand. His fingers released it without instruction. The way the body sometimes makes decisions before the mind catches up, and the brown leather case landed on its side and fell open, and the papers inside, contracts, property documents, the deed he had driven all this way to process, slid out across the worn wooden floor in a slow, quiet fan. Nobody moved to pick them up. Adrian looked at them for a moment. Pages of careful legal language. Clauses and subclauses and signatures. Millions of dollars represented in formatted paragraphs. The architecture of deals that had consumed his weeks and months and years. He had carried that briefcase into boardrooms in 4 countries. He had set it on tables in front of ministers and investors and men whose names appeared in financial papers. He had opened it with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and why. Looking at those papers scattered across the floor of this small wooden house, he felt nothing for them. Less than nothing. They looked like what they suddenly were. Documents belonging to a life that had been built on a lie he hadn't even known was a lie. He had been building empires while she was surviving. The thought arrived fully formed and landed without mercy. He had stood on a stage in Nairobi 18 months ago. He could remember it precisely, the lighting, the crowd, the sound of applause, and delivered a keynote address about resilience. About what it means to keep moving when life takes everything from you. About grief as a foundation rather than an ending. People had recorded it on their phones. Someone had clipped 30 seconds of it, and it had circulated online for weeks. Colleagues had sent it to him with messages about how powerful it was. He had meant every word. That was the thing. He had genuinely believed he was speaking from experience. While he was speaking about resilience from a stage with a microphone and a spotlight, Lila was in this room, in this house, washing the same few items of clothing and carrying water in a clay jug and carving, or watching someone carve, or finding some way to produce a small toy car so that their son would have something to hold in his hands. While he was being photographed for a business profile that described him as a man who had rebuilt himself from loss, she was teaching Micah to walk. Teaching him to talk, answering the questions children ask at 2 and 3 and 4 in the morning about why the sky goes dark, and what sound does the big cat make, and where do people go when they're not here anymore. Micah. Adrian closed his eyes. He saw 5 birthdays. Not clearly. He had no memories of them, which was precisely the devastation. He saw 5 blank spaces where birthdays should have been. A first birthday with a child who doesn't understand what celebration is, but reaches for the color and the light of it anyway. A second, a third, where the child starts to understand that this day belongs specifically to him. A fourth, a fifth that hadn't happened yet, but would, and he had not been there for a single one. First steps. He didn't know when they happened. Didn't know if Lila had cried when they happened, if she had reached out instinctively to steady him and then stopped herself to let him find his own balance. Didn't know if Micah had fallen and laughed or fallen and looked up at her waiting for a signal about whether falling was something to be afraid of. First word, he didn't know what it was. He would have to ask. He would have to sit across from his 4-year-old son and ask him questions about a past they should have shared together. He would have to reconstruct his child's life from description rather than memory. The way you reconstruct a building from photographs after it's already been standing for years. The rage came then. Not Lila. He understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that there was no version of what she had done that could be called betrayal. She had been put in a concrete room while pregnant and alone and given a choice that wasn't a choice, and she had made the only decision available to a person who loves someone and has nothing else left to use as protection. The rage was for the men in that warehouse. The ones with no names and no visible faces and enough reach inside the system to falsify dental records and bend official investigations and relocate a woman and her unborn child to a remote house and then simply wait for the world to accept the story they had planted. He had accepted it. That was what the rage turned toward when it finished with the nameless architects and found him standing there. He had accepted it. He had attended the funeral. He had shaken hands and received condolences and returned to his hotel room and dismantled himself quietly and then rebuilt himself into something harder and more driven. And he had never, not once, looked at the inconsistencies. And there had been inconsistencies. The investigation had closed remarkably fast. He remembered thinking so at the time and then setting the thought aside because grief had its own gravity and it was pulling him in a direction that had no room for questions. The body identification had been handled without him. He had been told it was better that way, kinder that way, and he had let someone make that decision for him because he had not trusted his own legs to carry him into that room. He had assumed fate. Fate had been arranged. "I wanted to come back," Lila said from across the room. Her voice was careful, not asking for forgiveness, not yet, maybe not today, just telling him something true. "There were nights when Micah was sick, and I had nothing, and I wanted to call you so badly I had to sit on my hands to stop myself." Adrian looked at her. I didn't know if they were still watching. I didn't know if the threat was still active. And then Micah got older and he started asking questions, and I thought, if I surface now, if I bring us back into view, and they're still there, she stopped. Looked toward the cot. Micah had fallen asleep, his small hand still resting on the toy car. "I couldn't risk him. I'm sorry. I know that cost you everything, but I couldn't risk him." He understood. That was the part that broke him open completely. Not the rage, not the grief, not the 5 blank birthdays. It was the understanding. Because he knew, standing in this room, that if their positions had been reversed, if he had been the one in that warehouse, the one given that ultimatum with her life and his child's safety on the other side of it, he would have made the same choice. He would have made the same choice every single morning for 5 years. The first tear surprised him. He hadn't cried since the night of the phone call. Not properly. He had kept it compressed into something manageable and pushed it below the surface where it couldn't interfere with function. He had become very good at that. But there are things the body will not compress forever. He sat down on the floor. Not on a stool. On the floor, among the scattered papers of a life he no longer recognized. In a house he had driven here to erase, and he put his face in his hands. And for the first time in 5 years, Adrian Vale, who had built himself into something formidable and unassailable, simply wept. Friends, if this chapter moved you, if you felt that moment when a man who has everything finally breaks, please like this video right now. It means more than you know. Subscribe if you haven't, because Chapter 6 is coming and Adrian is done grieving. Next chapter, he starts asking questions, and the answers are going to lead somewhere nobody expected. Drop a comment below. What do you think Adrian's next move should be? Should he go to the authorities, hire investigators, or handle this himself? Tell us. We read every single one. The phone vibrated in his jacket pocket. Adrian didn't move at first. He was still on the floor among the scattered papers. His face dry now, but his eyes carrying the particular heaviness that comes after a man has finally allowed himself to feel something he's been holding back for years. Lila had moved to the cot and was sitting beside Micah, one hand resting lightly on the boy's back as he slept, watching Adrian with an expression that held no judgment, only the quiet patience of someone who had learned to wait. The phone buzzed again. He reached into his pocket and looked at the screen. Marcus Osei, Chief of Security. Adrian frowned slightly. Marcus did not call without reason. In 7 years of working together, the man had never once made a call that turned out to be trivial. He was former military intelligence, precise and economical with everything. Words, time, action. If he was calling on a Saturday afternoon, something had moved. Adrian stood. He straightened his jacket from habit and stepped toward the door. "I need to take this," he said quietly. Lila nodded once. He stepped outside into the open air, pulling the door partway, closed behind him. The countryside stretched before him, wide and green and indifferent, the afternoon light now lower and warmer, casting long shadows across the red dirt yard. He pressed the phone to his ear. "Marcus." "Sir." Marcus's voice was steady as always, but underneath the steadiness was something Adrian recognized as controlled urgency. The tone of a man delivering information he knows will change the shape of a conversation permanently. "I apologize for the timing. I wouldn't call if it weren't significant." "Go ahead." "The forensic audit you ordered last month on the pre-merger financial records. Our team flagged something this morning. A cluster of transactions from approximately 5 years ago. Shell companies routed through 3 separate offshore accounts. The structures are sophisticated, but the trail is there if you know where to look." Adrian's jaw tightened. "How much?" "The amounts are not the issue, sir. The destination is." A brief pause. "We traced the beneficial ownership back through 4 layers of incorporation. The companies at the end of the chain are linked, quietly, indirectly, but provably, to Meridian Capital Group." The name landed like a stone dropping into still water. Adrian said nothing. "Sir, I heard you." His voice had gone very flat. "Say it again clearly, Marcus. You're telling me that the Shell Company transactions from 5 years ago trace back to Meridian?" "Yes, sir. The timing aligns specifically with the 4th quarter of that year. The transfers began approximately 6 weeks before." Marcus stopped himself. He knew the history. Everyone in Adrian's inner circle knew the history. 6 weeks before the incident with Mrs. Vale. Adrian turned away from the house and walked several paces into the open yard, stopping where the dirt gave way to the beginning of the long grass. He stood very still, looking out at the hills. Meridian Capital Group. He knew that name the way a surgeon knows the name of a particularly complicated procedure, intimately, technically, with a memory attached to every detail. 5.5 years ago, Adrian had executed one of the most aggressive hostile takeovers of his career against Meridian. They had been a mid-sized property development firm with regional influence, significant political connections, and a leadership structure that had grown comfortable and slow. Adrian had identified the vulnerability, moved fast, acquired a controlling stake through a proxy before they understood what was happening, and restructured the company's core assets within 8 months. Meridian's board had been dissolved. Its founder, a man named Gerald Uma, old money, old pride, had been publicly, professionally humiliated. The financial press had covered it extensively. Adrian had given an interview afterward in which he described it as simply good business. He had not spent significant time thinking about the people on the other side of that deal. He was thinking about them now. The calculation assembled itself in his mind with the cold efficiency of a man who had spent 20 years reading the architecture of other people's decisions. 6 weeks after the Meridian takeover concluded, unknown operatives had forced Lila off a road, staged her death with falsified records and planted evidence, and relocated her to a remote rural house under quiet supervision. The motive resolved itself with brutal clarity. This had never been personal hatred. Not in the way personal hatred operates, hot and irrational and hungry for direct confrontation. This was something colder, something that sat at a table and drew diagrams and measured outcomes. Gerald Uma, or someone in his circle, had looked at Adrian Vale and asked a single strategic question. What is this man's weakness? And the answer they had arrived at was Lila. Not because they wanted to hurt her, not even primarily because they wanted to hurt Adrian, but because they had understood something that Adrian himself had perhaps only half acknowledged, that the right loss, delivered at the right moment, could hollow out a rising competitor more efficiently than any legal challenge or financial countermove. Grief was the weapon. Emotional destabilization was the strategy. A man drowning in loss would make poor decisions, withdraw from key opportunities, perhaps collapse entirely under the weight of it. They had weaponized his love for his wife. They had turned the best part of him into a liability and then detonated it. Adrian stood in the open air and breathed slowly and let the full shape of it settle over him. He thought about the keynote speech, the profile pieces, the years of cold, driven, relentless expansion he had channeled every piece of himself into because there was nothing else left to fill the space that losing Lila had created. He thought about the deals he had closed with the particular ferocity of a man who has nothing personal left to protect and therefore nothing to hold him back. The irony arrived quietly and sat beside the rage. They had tried to break him. Instead, they had accelerated him. His grief had not made him collapse. It had made him dangerous. He had become colder, sharper, more ruthless in negotiation, more willing to absorb risk because risk had stopped feeling significant once the thing he most feared losing was already gone. They had tried to weaponize his love, and he had weaponized his grief right back at them, without even knowing it, without ever understanding that there had been an enemy on the other side of his loss watching the results with what must have been mounting disbelief. He had won, and it had cost him everything that actually mattered. "Marcus," he said. His voice was quiet and very precise. "I want documentation of everything. Every transaction, every incorporation record, every thread of connection between those shell companies and Meridian. I want it clean, sourced, and legally defensible." "Understood, sir." "How quickly?" "As quickly as it can be done correctly." He paused. "And Marcus, this stays between us for now. No wider circulation. No outside counsel until I say so." "Yes, sir." He ended the call. He stood there for a long moment in the open green countryside, phone at his side, the late afternoon wind moving slowly across the grass. Somewhere behind him in the small wooden house, his son was sleeping with one hand on a carved toy car, and the woman he had buried in a closed coffin 5 years ago was sitting beside him watching over him the way she had watched over him every single day of his life. For 5 years, Adrian had believed he was a man who had been struck by fate, a man tested by the randomness of tragedy. He had built an identity around that narrative, the man who lost everything and rebuilt himself. It had felt true. It had felt earned. Now he understood that there had been nothing random about any of it. He had not been struck by fate. He had been struck by a decision made in a room by people with a motive and a plan and enough reach to execute it cleanly enough that it had looked like fate for half a decade. He had been manipulated. His grief had been engineered. His son's first 5 years had been stolen not by accident or tragedy, but by calculation, by men who had sat around a table and decided that this was an acceptable move in a business conflict. He breathed in, held it, released it slowly. The hills in the distance were very green and very still. He turned and looked back at the house. Through the warped window glass, he could make out the faint shape of Lila moving inside. He was not alone. He had not been defeated. And the men who had believed that engineering his loss would end him had made one catastrophic error in their calculation. They had left him alive. They had left her alive. And they had no idea what was coming. Friends, the enemy has a name now. And Adrian Vale did not build an empire by letting things go. Chapter 7 is coming. And the man who once crushed Meridian Capital in a boardroom is about to come for them in a very different way, with 5 years of grief, a living wife, and a son he never got to hold as a baby fueling every single move. Subscribe right now so you don't miss it. Like this video if this story has you locked in. It genuinely helps us reach more people. And drop a comment below. Do you think Adrian should go the legal route or handle Meridian the way Meridian handled him? Tell us. Michael was awake. He hadn't made a sound coming out of sleep. No groggy crying, no disorientation. He had simply opened his eyes, looked at the ceiling for a moment the way children do when they're deciding what kind of day it is, and then pushed himself upright on the cot with both hands and looked directly at Adrian standing in the doorway. The toy car was still in his hand. Adrian had come back inside slowly. Phone returned to his pocket. The information from Marcus Osei, now folded away in a part of his mind, reserved for things that required action rather than immediate reaction. He was good at that compartmentalization. It had served him well in business for years. But something had shifted in him during those minutes, standing in the open countryside, breathing the wide, clean air and looking at the hills. The compartments felt different now, rearranged. as though the architecture he had spent 5 years carefully constructing had quietly, irreversibly changed its own floor plan while he wasn't looking. Micah watched him cross the room. Adrian stopped a few feet away and looked down at his son. This small, serious person who had his jaw in his eyes and apparently his habit of observing a situation fully before committing to a response. For years old and already reading rooms. Already measuring people before deciding how much of himself to offer them. Adrian lowered himself to one knee. It was not a graceful movement in a tailored suit on a wooden floor, and under other circumstances it might have looked awkward. A billionaire in Italian leather kneeling in a rural house with papers still scattered behind him, but was the only appropriate distance. Eye level, the place where you go when you want someone to understand that you are not standing above them, that you're not a figure in a doorway, but a person in a room, present and accountable. Micah held his ground, did not step back, did not step forward, just watched. Adrian reached out slowly, giving the boy time to see the movement coming, and placed his hand on Micah's small shoulder. Gently, steadily, the way you place your hand on something you're terrified of losing. He felt the warmth of him through the fabric of the too big yellow shirt. He felt him breathing. Micah. His voice was different from the voice he used in boardrooms and negotiations and keynote addresses. Lower, quieter, stripped of the professional architecture entirely. My name is Adrian. I am your father. The boy looked at him with those dark, careful eyes. And I'm not leaving again. He meant it the way men mean things when they have finally, after a very long time, arrived at the truest version of themselves. Not through inspiration or ambition, but through loss and reckoning and the particular clarity that comes when you kneel on a wooden floor in a rural house and look into the face of everything you almost never knew existed. Micah was quiet for a moment. Then he held out the toy car. Not to give it away, just to show it. Look at this thing I have. Look at what matters in my world. Adrian looked at it. The badly painted blue sides, the slightly green patch where the paint had changed, the worn wheels from 1,000 small journeys across blankets and floors. Did someone make that for you? Adrian asked. Mama made it, Micah said. First words directly to his father. Simple, factual, trusting. Adrian nodded slowly. He did not trust himself to say anything else for a moment. He simply kept his hand on his son's shoulder and breathed. Behind him, he heard Lila move. He rose to his feet, and as he did, he pulled his phone from his pocket and made 2 calls in quick succession, brief, precise, professional. The first was to Marcus, directing him to arrange immediate, discreet security around the rural property by nightfall. Unmarked, unobtrusive, professional. Nobody in the village needed to know, but nobody would be approaching this house unobserved again. Not tonight, not while Adrian Vale was breathing. The second call was to his private legal counsel, initiating a confidential investigation into Meridian Capital Group's financial activities from 5 years prior. Not loud, not rushed, clean and careful and constructed properly, built to last, built to hold up in any jurisdiction, built to deliver not a personal reckoning, but something that would actually stand. Justice rather than revenge. The distinction mattered to him. It mattered more than it might have yesterday. He ended the calls and put the phone away. This was not the moment for Meridian. Meridian would keep. 5 years of carefully engineered crime did not resolve itself in an afternoon, and Adrian had learned, was learning right now, in this room, that the most important things rarely did. He turned toward Lila. She was standing near the window, the same position she had occupied during most of this conversation, as though the window offered something, light, distance, the option of looking away if the room became too much. Her arms were wrapped around herself again. She was watching him with an expression that had moved through many things in the past hour and had arrived somewhere complicated and undefended. Uncertain. That was the word. For the first time since he had known her. And he had known her through arguments and celebrations and ordinary Tuesday mornings and the specific intimacy of people who have shared years and a bed and the small, unglamorous details of daily life. She looked genuinely uncertain, as though she had carried the decision to protect him for so long, with such complete conviction, that now with him standing in the room, knowing everything, she no longer knew what she was carrying or whether it had been enough. Whether she was enough. After all of it. After all the silence and the years and the closed coffin and the grave marker with her name. Whether there was still something here that could be returned to. He crossed the room slowly. She watched him come. Did not move toward him. Did not move away. Just held herself still and watched with those amber eyes that had once lit up rooms and had spent 5 years learning a different kind of illumination. Quieter, more interior, harder one. He stopped in front of her. They looked at each other. Two people who had loved each other in a different life. Two people carrying the same orchestrated wound from opposite sides of it. Him with his 5 years of weaponized grief and cold ambition. Her with her 5 years of isolated protection and daily fear and the particular loneliness of keeping someone safe from a distance without being able to tell them you're doing it. The same tragedy. The same architects. The same loss. He opened his arms. She came into them not dramatically. Not with the sweeping urgency of reunion scenes in films, but the way exhausted people move toward rest. Carefully, as though she was still not entirely certain the ground would hold. And then her face pressed against his shoulder, and he felt the shudder move through her, and he held her, both arms around her completely, his chin resting on the top of her head. He held her the way a man holds something he had buried and been told was gone. Not as a billionaire reclaiming territory. Not as a husband asserting return, but as a person, only a person, all the power and money and carefully constructed identity stripped entirely away, who had been given something back that he had no right to expect the world to return. A second chance, impossible and unearned and here regardless. Micah appeared beside them a moment later. He pressed himself against Lila's side, one small hand gripping her dress, toy car still in the other. Looking up at both of them with the watchful calm of a child who does not yet have the words for what he is witnessing, but understands somewhere beneath language that something important has just changed the shape of his life. Adrian reached down with one hand without breaking the embrace and rested it on his son's head. The three of them stood in the small wooden house as the afternoon light came through the warped window glass and fell across the scattered legal papers on the floor. The documents for the sale, the contracts for the demolition. The deed that was supposed to end this place, and none of it meant anything at all. He had driven up this red dirt road to erase the last physical memory of her, to sell the house and sign the papers and drive back to the city a little lighter, a little cleaner, one fewer thing tethering him to a grief he had spent 5 years outrunning. He looked around the room, the clay water jug, the folded laundry, the simple wooden furniture worn smooth by daily use. The swept floor, the narrow cot, the hand-carved toy car, and the badly mixed paint and the worn wheels. This house was not a memory. This house was a life that had continued in the dark without him, quietly and stubbornly, the way life does when it has no other option, and it had produced something extraordinary in that dark, something he had not planned for and could not have engineered and would not have traded for anything his company had ever acquired. He had spent 5 years chasing the feeling of wholeness through the accumulation of things that looked like wholeness from the outside. Deals closed, towers built, net worth compounded, influence extended. He had been very good at it. He had been celebrated for it. And every night he had gone back to a life that was correct in every measurable dimension and felt, in the unmeasurable ones, completely empty. Standing in this room, in this imperfect and humble and real place, his wife breathing against his shoulder and his son pressed against his side. He did not feel empty. For the first time in 5 years, he felt entirely, undeniably whole. Friends, that moment, Adrian kneeling before Micah. Those words, "I am your father, and I am not leaving again." If that hit you somewhere deep, please like this video right now. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Subscribe and turn on notifications because Chapter 8 is coming and the investigation into Meridian is about to uncover something even darker than what we already know. Drop a comment below and tell us, what was the moment in this chapter that got to you the most? Was it Adrian kneeling before Micah? The embrace? Or the toy car? Tell us. We read every single comment. See you in the next video.